Today we're diving deep into professional revenge, and this one is absolutely genius. We're talking about a micromanaging boss who thought he could control every minute of his employee's day, and the most creative use of company policies and malicious compliance you've ever heard of. This story comes from David, a software developer who turned his boss's own control freak tendencies against him in the most spectacular way possible. What David did will make every person who's ever had a terrible boss want to give him a standing ovation. So buckle up, because this revenge story involves time tracking, company regulations, and the most satisfying takedown of a power-hungry manager you've ever seen. David had been working as a software developer at TechFlow Solutions for 3 years. He was one of their best employees, always met his deadlines, wrote clean code, and got along great with his team. David loved his job and was really good at what he did. The company had always been pretty relaxed about work schedules. As long as you got your projects done on time and attended important meetings, nobody cared if you took a long lunch or left early on a Friday. It was the kind of workplace where results mattered more than hours spent in a chair. But then David's old manager retired, and the company hired Richard Palmer as the new department head. Richard was everything wrong with corporate management rolled into one person. He was the type of guy who thought that if he wasn't watching you work, you weren't actually working. He believed that employees needed constant supervision or they'd slack off. Richard's first week on the job, he called a department meeting to announce his new, mocking productivity initiatives. Richard's new rules were absolutely insane for a software development team. First, everyone had to log their exact arrival and departure times using a special app he'd installed. Not just clocking in and out, detailed logs of when you sat down at your desk, when you left for breaks, when you came back, everything. Second, all bathroom breaks had to be logged. Richard actually said, controlling, "I need to know where my team is at all times for productivity optimization." Third, lunch breaks were limited to exactly 45 minutes, and you had to notify Richard when you were leaving and when you returned. Fourth, Richard instituted stern desk checks, where he'd walk around every hour to make sure people were at their computers working. If you weren't at your desk, you had to explain where you were and why. Fifth, all personal phone calls, text messages, or non-work internet browsing was strictly forbidden. Richard installed monitoring software to track everyone's computer activity. The entire team was miserable within a week. These weren't lazy employees, they were professional software developers who had been successfully managing their own time for years. David tried to adapt to Richard's new system, but it was impossible. Software development doesn't work on a strict schedule. Sometimes you need to think through a problem, research solutions, or collaborate with teammates. You can't just code nonstop for 8 hours like you're working on an assembly line. Richard didn't understand this, and he zeroed in on David as his primary target. David would get pulled into Richard's office multiple times a day for productivity discussions. Richard would question why David had taken a 12-minute bathroom break instead of 10 minutes. He'd demand explanations for why David had spent 20 minutes talking to a teammate about a project. The worst part was Richard's surprise evaluations. He'd sneak up behind David's computer and demand to see exactly what David was working on at that exact moment. If David was reading documentation or researching a solution, Richard would accuse him of wasting time on non-essential activities. Richard also started scheduling unnecessary meetings just to interrupt David's workflow. He'd call 30-minute meetings to discuss things that could have been handled in a 2-minute email. David's productivity actually started declining because he was spending more time documenting his activities for Richard than actually doing his job. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon. David had been working on a complex coding problem for 2 days. He was finally making progress and was in that focused state that programmers call the zone, where everything clicks and the code flows perfectly. Richard walked up behind David and started reading over his shoulder. "Stern, what exactly are you doing right now?" Richard demanded. "Focused. I'm debugging the authentication module for the Johnson project," David explained without looking away from his screen. "I've been tracking down this error for—" "Abruptly stop," Richard interrupted. "Stern, turn around and look at me when I'm talking to you." David reluctantly turned around, knowing that breaking his concentration would cost him at least an hour of work. "Firmly, I need you to document exactly what you've been doing for the past 45 minutes, Richard said, handing David a form. "I need timestamps, specific activities, and justification for each task. David stared at the form. It was 3 pages long and would take at least 30 minutes to fill out properly. Frustrated, "Richard, I'm right in the middle of solving this bug," pleading, "If I stop now, I'll lose my train of thought and have to start over. Can I fill this out after I finish this section?" Coldly, "No," Richard said firmly. Authoritative, "Company policy states that productivity documentation takes priority over all other tasks. Fill out the form now." David spent the next 45 minutes filling out Richard's ridiculous form. By the time he finished, he'd completely lost his mental focus on the coding problem. What should have been another hour of work turned into the rest of the day trying to get back to where he'd been. That night, David went home and started planning his revenge. David spent his weekend doing something Richard probably never expected. He read the entire employee handbook, all company policies, and every HR regulation that TechFlow Solutions had on file. David discovered some very interesting things. First, the company had very specific policies about workplace harassment and creating hostile work environments. Richard's constant interruptions and excessive monitoring could definitely qualify. Second, there were detailed regulations about overtime pay and break requirements. Richard's strict timing rules were actually violating several labor laws. Third, the company had a employee efficiency protection policy that prohibited managers from implementing systems that reduced overall productivity. But most importantly, David found a policy that was going to be the key to his revenge, the Malicious Compliance Protection Clause. This policy stated that if an employee followed all company rules and manager directives exactly as written, they could not be disciplined for reduced productivity that resulted from following those rules to the letter. David realized that Richard had given him the perfect weapon, his own obsessive rulemaking. David's revenge plan was beautifully simple. He was going to follow every single one of Richard's rules perfectly, exactly as written, without any exceptions. If Richard wanted detailed time tracking, David would give him detailed time tracking. If Richard wanted productivity documentation, David would document everything. If Richard wanted to know where David was at all times, David would make sure Richard knew exactly where he was every single minute of the day. David was going to be the most compliant employee in the history of the company, and it was going to drive Richard absolutely insane. Monday morning, David arrived at work with a new notebook, a stopwatch, and a commitment to following every rule Richard had created. David's first email to Richard that morning was sent at 8:47 a.m. Richard arrived at parking lot at 8:43 a.m. Walk to building entrance, arrival time 8:45 a.m. Elevator wait time 2 minutes. Arrived at desk at 8:47 a.m. Beginning work startup routine. Will email progress update in 15 minutes as per productivity tracking requirements. Richard probably thought David was being sarcastic, but David was just getting started. Richard, computer fully loaded at 9:01 a.m. Reviewed priority task list, 3 minutes. Beginning work on Johnson Project Authentication Module. Will provide next update at 9:30 a.m. Richard Johnson Project Progress Update. Reviewed previous day's code, 12 minutes. Identified 3 potential problem areas. Beginning debugging process. Bathroom break required. Will email departure and return times. Richard departed desk for bathroom break at 9:45 a.m. Returned at 9:47 a.m. Resuming Johnson project work. David sent Richard an email every 15-30 minutes all day long, documenting every single activity in excruciating detail. By Tuesday, Richard was getting annoyed with David's constant emails, but he couldn't complain because David was just following the rules Richard had created. So David escalated to phase 2. Richard's rules said that all breaks and departures from the desk had to be logged and approved. So David started requesting permission for everything. Richard, need to use bathroom. Estimated time away from desk, 8-10 minutes, please approve. Richard, teammate Jane needs to discuss Johnson project integration. Meeting estimated at 15 minutes, please approve departure from desk. Richard, printer is out of paper. Need to walk to supply closet to get more paper. Estimated time, 5 minutes. Please approve. David was literally asking permission to do basic workplace activities. Exactly as Richard's policies required, Richard tried to tell David to use common sense and stop asking for permission for every little thing. But David had anticipated this, feigning innocence. "I want to make sure I'm following all policies correctly," David would say. "The productivity tracking guidelines you created say all departures from workstation must be pre-approved. I'm just trying to be compliant." By Wednesday, Richard was clearly frustrated, but David wasn't done yet. Richard's policy stated that all work activities needed to be optimized for maximum productivity. So David started requesting meetings to optimize his productivity. Formal. "Richard, I need to schedule a productivity optimization meeting to discuss the Johnson project timeline. The debugging process is taking longer than expected due to interruptions for documentation requirements. Please advise on priority balancing." Formal. "Richard, request meeting to clarify bathroom break duration policies. Current guideline states reasonable time, but doesn't specify exact minutes. Need clarification to ensure compliance." Formal. "Richard, need productivity consultation regarding email response time requirements. Currently spending 2 to 3 hours daily on status update emails. Request guidance on streamlining documentation process." David was using Richard's own meeting-heavy management style against him, but with completely legitimate requests based on Richard's own policies. By Thursday, David had created a paper trail that was absolutely incredible. He had documented every single interruption Richard had caused, with exact timestamps and duration. He had records of every unnecessary meeting, every productivity discussion, and every time Richard had broken David's concentration. David calculated that Richard's monitoring and documentation requirements were taking up 3.2 hours of David's 8-hour workday. That meant David was only able to do actual work for 4.8 hours per day, a 40% reduction in productivity. But here's the brilliant part. David had been getting his actual work done by staying late and working through lunches. His project deliverables were still on time and high quality. He was just documenting how much extra time Richard's policies were forcing him to work. By Friday, Richard was drowning in David's compliance. David had sent Richard 47 emails that week, requested 23 different approvals, and scheduled 8 productivity optimization meetings. Richard's entire day was being consumed by managing David's strict adherence to the policies Richard had created. But the best part was that David was following every rule perfectly. Richard couldn't discipline him or tell him to stop because David was just doing exactly what Richard had required. Other employees started noticing what David was doing, and a few of them began implementing their own versions of malicious compliance. Richard found himself managing a department where employees were asking permission to sharpen pencils, requesting meetings to discuss the productivity implications of coffee breaks, and sending hourly status updates on basic tasks. The following Monday, Richard called David into his office for what he probably thought would be a disciplinary meeting. "David, this needs to stop. Your constant emails and meeting requests are getting ridiculous." David pulled out a folder. He'd been preparing for this moment all week. Feigning innocence. "I'm confused, Richard." Calmly. "I'm just following the productivity tracking and documentation policies you implemented." Questioning. "Are you saying you want me to stop complying with company policies?" Accusingly. "You're being deliberately disruptive." Calmly. "Actually, I've been tracking my productivity metrics since you became my manager. Before your new policies, I was completing an average of 23 development tasks per week. Since implementing your tracking requirements, I'm averaging 14 tasks per week, a 39% decrease in actual productivity." David showed Richard his documentation. Factual. The time tracking, documentation requirements, and constant approval requests are consuming 3.2 hours of my workday. I'm having to work unpaid overtime to meet my project deadlines. Angry. "You're doing this on purpose to make me look bad." Calmly. "I'm doing this to comply with your policies." Assertively. "If following your rules exactly as written is making you look bad, maybe the problem isn't with my compliance." Richard was furious, but David wasn't done. His next move was pure genius. David scheduled a meeting with HR to discuss productivity optimization and policy compliance concerns. When David met with HR, he presented his week of documentation as evidence of workplace efficiency problems. "I want to make sure I'm following all policies correctly," David told the HR manager. But I'm concerned that the current productivity tracking requirements are creating inefficiencies that are impacting the company's bottom line. David showed HR his calculations. Richard's policies were reducing the entire development team's productivity by an average of 35%. The department was missing deadlines and going over budget on projects because developers were spending more time on documentation than actual development. HR was shocked. They had no idea that Richard's productivity initiatives were actually destroying productivity. But David had saved the best for last. I'm also concerned about potential labor law violations, David said, pulling out another folder. The break monitoring and bathroom tracking policies may violate state regulations about employee privacy and break requirements. HR launched an investigation into Richard's management practices, and what they found was damning. Not only were Richard's policies reducing productivity across the entire department, but several of them were actually illegal. The bathroom monitoring violated privacy laws. The excessive overtime caused by documentation requirements violated wage and hour regulations. The constant interruptions and surveillance created a hostile work environment. HR also discovered that 3 valuable employees had already started looking for other jobs because of Richard's management style. The investigation took 2 weeks, and during that time, David continued his malicious compliance campaign. Every day, Richard received dozens of emails, approval requests, and meeting invitations from David and other team members who had joined the movement. Richard was spending so much time managing his own bureaucracy that he wasn't able to do any actual managing. 3 weeks after David started his malicious compliance campaign, Richard was called into a meeting with HR and the company's senior management. He was given a choice: resign voluntarily or be terminated for creating a hostile work environment and implementing policies that violated labor laws. Richard chose to resign. The company brought back the previous relaxed management style, eliminated all of Richard's productivity tracking requirements, and apologized to the development team for the disruption. David was personally thanked by senior management for bringing the issues to their attention in such a thorough and professional manner. 6 months later, when the company was looking for a new department head, guess who they offered the position to? David declined the management role. He preferred coding to managing, but he was promoted to senior developer with a significant raise and was put in charge of establishing new productivity guidelines for the development team. David's new guidelines were simple: meet your deadlines, write good code, collaborate with your team, and manage your own time like the professional you are. The department's productivity increased by 60% within 3 months of implementing David's common sense approach. David is still working at TechFlow Solutions and loving his job. The development team is more productive and happier than ever, and David has become something of a legend in the company for his creative solution to the Richard problem. Richard? Well, let's just say his reputation in the industry took a hit. Word gets around in the tech world, and most companies do reference checks. Richard's next few job interviews apparently didn't go very well when his former employers were contacted. Last David heard, Richard was working as a middle manager at a much smaller company for significantly less money than he was making at TechFlow. The best part? David's malicious compliance strategy has been adopted by employees at other companies dealing with similar micromanagement problems. David's approach has become a case study in professional resistance to workplace bullying. So what do you think about David's malicious compliance masterpiece? Have you ever had to deal with a micromanaging boss like Richard? How did you handle it? Drop your workplace revenge stories in the comments below. I love reading about creative solutions to terrible managers. Smash that like button and subscribe for more workplace revenge stories. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Tomorrow, I've got a story about roommate revenge that involves a passive-aggressive note war and the most creative use of kitchen appliances you've ever heard of. Thanks for watching, and see you on the next one.